Welcome to the Tiny Box Dialogues. This series was created to share the knowledge of our experts using real examples from real people with real stories. Welcome to Tiny Box Dialogues. Today we are speaking to Paul Brewerton. Now, Paul is a chartered occupational psychologist and doctor of organizational psychology. He put that to good use this last 25 years, helping organizations and their people navigate change. And we know there's been a lot of change over the last few decades, but the challenges can be overcome, and you help people to develop an understanding of themselves and leverage that to increase their performance, right? To drive up their performance. So why don't we just jump right in, Paul, and we'll get some of your history as we discuss. Why don't we dive right in and define personality tests for the uninitiated? I'm pretty sure most people have taken some form of a personality test, but let's start at the beginning.
Yeah, thank you, Raj. It's really good to be here. Thank you for the invitation, and I'm looking forward to talking a bit more about one of my many loves in life, and the psychometric test definitely falls in that category. So personality tests, you asked the question where they kind of fall in the world, and they fall they're a category of psychometric tests, essentially, and there are two broad ones. Psychometric, by the way, means psychological measurement. It's important that we kind of hold that, because I think as we go through the discussion, we'll come back to the science behind this, which is a really important part of what psychometric actually is. So personality tests are measures of typical behaviour. So that's behaviour that people would generally exhibit in most circumstances, in most contexts. So that's the important thing to know about personality tests. The other big category of psychometric tests is ability tests. Mm-hmm. They tend to be related more to tests of maximum performance. So how can you perform in this area of technical expertise, in this area of knowledge? So that could be spatial reasoning, it could be verbal reasoning, arithmetic reasoning, and so on. But personality is more about typical behaviour rather than sort of maximum performance. That's the two broad categories. And how they work is that they ask basically a bunch of questions about each aspect of personality that they're interested in. So typically the minimum for a psychometric would be around 6 to 8 questions per trait of personality. That would be the minimum. That means that from a user experience point of view, it can feel a bit samey, it can feel slightly repetitive, but it's really important because I've mentioned the science around psychometrics. And in order for a test to be accurate, you need to ask slightly different versions of the same question repeatedly to make sure that you've got the right answer, essentially.
Yeah, I think that's a core point, is that often people will answer what they think that somebody wants to know rather than actually what they do feel. And by asking it in different ways, you get to the core truth of the matter. That's lovely. And why did it seems like they really took on a life of their own in the last few decades, right? I mean, we did it in the MBA, we did it in the Bachelor of Commerce, we do it at work, we do it everywhere. Why did organizations start using them? Like, when did they? Why did they?
Yeah, I mean, well, actually, psychometrics go way back to the late sort of 1800s in terms of looking at. I suppose it was IQ before IQ was called IQ, so it was kind of looking at broad intelligence. That's where they originated, and they started to be used pre-World War I or during World War I, particularly for army recruitment. I think in the end, actually, pretty much everyone was recruited into World War I. They kind of lost that. Need for a sift, but originally it was to do with who's going to be a really good recruit into the armed forces. They wanted some kind of predictive validity around that, so that's where it began. And obviously, wartime kind of it does create innovation out of necessity. Mm-hmm. So that happened again during World War II. I think it was post World War II where really psychometrics in organisations started to take on a life of their own. And we know now it's around 80% of the FTSE 100, FTSE 250, Fortune 500, whatever equivalent you want to use wherever you are in the world. The majority of leading organisations in that territory will be using psychometrics. And the reason is, if they're psychometrics and they are proper psychometrics, and by that I mean they're reliable, they're valid, they've been tested scientifically to make sure they work over time, over situation, in a consistent, accurate way. And they work, therefore, they're going to add what we call incremental validity to a selection process, and also to people's development activities. They can create great insight for individuals when you look at them in a development context, and they can predict whether someone's going to, you know, do a good job in a particular target role that you may be looking to recruit into. So they're in there because in the mix of options that you have, development, they add insight. When it comes to recruitment and selection, they add incremental validity over and above other forms like interviews, structured interviews, by the way, rather than unstructured, because they're not particularly predictive. Assessment centres, they kind of typically form a part of an assessment centre these days, when you might have a whole bunch of other forms of assessment. So, you know, that's kind of why psychometrics are used, because they do a job. You know, they can be, if you've done a local validation study to make sure that the psychometric picked is appropriate to the role that you're recruiting for, or the development context that you're working with, then, you know, they can be super useful. But I think some of the downsides and drawbacks and some of the bad rep actually that has come to psychometrics has probably come from, you're probably going too far to say misuse in that context, but, you know, not perhaps using them exactly for the applications or the needs that they were designed for. So that's a super important, like, 101. Know what it is that you want to use a psychometric for before you just throw in a generic because you've heard that that's a good thing to use. Know what it is that you want it to do, and make sure it's going to do that job for you.
So before we continue, Paul, I just want to let you know that you are cutting a little bit in and out. So if you can pull the mic a little bit closer to you. So
Sure.
Is that okay? Sorry.
Yeah.
I didn't want to interrupt because it's such valuable information, but I know when people are listening, it getting the lower and higher is going to be a bit of a problem. So that a little bit closer and you're clear as
Clear as day. Is that feeling better? I don't know.
Perfect. That's perfect. Thank you so much. Sorry to interrupt you. So, you know, that like one of the things that I think that are the biggest fear for people, and this is why they try to game the system and actually figure out what the answers are, is exactly what you said, that organizations aren't necessarily using or weren't necessarily using them in the way they were intended, or they were using them as a barrier to hiring, or they were using it to make that hiring decision, which is not always accurate, right? So could you share some examples of where you've seen it poorly used or used really well, and what the outcomes were from that?
I mean, I think in terms of poor use or misuse, and there are examples of that. There are examples of abuse, you know, when organisations have, or perhaps they're not using trained employees. You know, they're kind of somehow accessing these psychometrics and then including them in a recruitment process where they haven't done the local validation work. So therefore, it's effectively unjustifiable, actually in some countries unlawful, to be using that tool in order to make recruitment decisions. And that can put companies in hot water, right? If you haven't done the work to figure out which test is going to be fit for purpose and appropriate for a particular role, for a particular context, and if you don't have a justification for it, particularly in the US, clearly, you know, it's highly litigious generally. Employment law is very much stacked towards the applicant, the candidate, you know, the employee, rightly so. Then, you know, you can really get on the wrong side of that. So you have to be really careful about making sure you're doing that work, doing that initial work. It's more flexible in the development context. You know, there's maybe not so much riding on it in terms of decision. It's not seen as such a high stakes decision, if you like. And we talk about, you know, the psychometric world is whether it's high stakes or not. Development, though, you know, you still have skin in that game, right? It's still important that what is coming back to you is accurate and appropriate. And I think, you know, for everybody using psychometrics, it's really important that you check in with yourself. Is that profile coming back resonant for you? Does it work for you? Does it look like you? And if not, you can ask questions about it. And ultimately, you know, and you and I in the past have used Myers-Briggs. You're familiar with that as a tool. The people who develop that do, you know, make the comment, the point that it's really important that your reported self that comes through, you know, completely a questionnaire, actually feels like you as yourself. So you need to ultimately make the decision and the call as to, you know, whether it looks like you, whether it really is you, or whether actually it's slightly out for whatever reason. So, you know, I think there are, you know, my advice actually, if you're going to use psychometrics properly, is get a professional in or get trained, do the work to work out which psychometric or psychometrics you're wanting to use. Maybe take a sounding from your own network, but that in itself is more face validity than true validity. And do the work to find out whether the tool is fit for purpose Is it reliable? Is it valid? Where I go to find out is this is like just a real quick sort of run the rule over it without actually doing a huge amount of in-depth work to see if it's going to work for me in a particular context. Is you go into the Psychological Testing Centre. This is a UK organisation. It's part of the British Psychological Society. They have a test registration process, which has a very high bar in terms of getting through the door. So you have to have done the work, making sure it's a reliable tool, a valid tool, it works in different contexts. And if the tool that you're interested in is on the list, that means it's psychometrically fit for purpose.
Yeah,
it's
that it's tested. Yeah.
It's not going to tell you it's, you know, it won't tell you all the detail. You know, the fact that on the list, you need to like dig into that, maybe get the full test results back, and you have to pay for that. But if it's on the list and that is publicly accessible and free, then you know you're going to know that it's pretty much going to do a job for you that will work. It's then up to you to decide which job that should be. So you ultimately have to be the arbiter of that decision. You know, do I need a personality test in my recruitment process, in my development process?
Yeah.
Do I need a test of arithmetic and verbal reasoning? They're often thrown in without really much thought given to whether they're necessary, super necessary for the role, or whether there could be different tests that would be more useful.
I think that's, I mean, you bring up a very good point, because I think there's also a lot of assumptions that are made, and we've talked about this before, where I had used the 5-factor model actually for an organization in London, and they, you know, they were a sales team and they thought that extroverts were just naturally good salespeople. And when we did this analysis, and I think this is where you're talking about not just fit for purpose, but what is the purpose of using it? What is it that you're trying to determine, right? Is it the personality diversity or the right person in the role? Because we don't often know the right person for the role. Sure, there are certain types that fit certain roles, but that doesn't mean other people can't learn the skills to do those roles. And so what we found was that of 250 people, 249 were extroverts. So how's that diverse? And of course, what we found was the one that was the introvert, actually, because it was a longevity of the sales cycle, he was actually having the highest sales because he was developing deeper relationships with them. That's not to say that an extrovert can't develop a deeper relationship. It's just to say it's a natural tendency, right? So I think that's what you're referring to. And a lot of people just kind of label it with do the 16 personalities or do the MBTI, but what for? What are you trying to achieve with that, right?
That's local validation, right? So that's data driven. It's saying, actually, we need to find a group of high performers in the role, a group of performers in the role, test them both as groups, then look at the differences in their profiles, right? Then look at you know, actually, are there certain tests and tools which are better predictors of whether someone's going to fall into the high performer group or not? As I say, I think with development, it's a little bit more relaxed. You know, there's a different set of challenges around using it in development, but still people will balk at something that doesn't seem to describe them well. You can lose credibility if you're running a development session with a tool that doesn't seem to work, or it maybe reports back you know, different results over time, as many of them do. If they have low, what we call retest reliability, you do it one time, you come back in 3 months, you do it again, you get a different set of results. That could really undermine people's you know, sense that, you know, this is being run professionally, or this tool is helpful, it's going to, you know, be consistent over time.
So you know what, and I know you have some experience in MBTI, and we've talked about it and we worked with it together. But what was it that you didn't like about this particular tool that made you want to create your own? Because it is quite a journey. Like you said, there's a lot of rigorous testing and rules and regulations around creating a psychometric. So what was it that motivated you? And do tell us a little bit about StrengthScope, which you've got the beautiful visual behind you, and do stay close to the mic.
Oh, sorry. Is it?
No, it's good. It's good.
I don't know how close I have to get into the mic. That's too much.
That's great right there.
That's a good idea. Okay, maybe you do need to see my face even closer up. Okay, I'll move in.
It's good.
So, good question. I've been designing psychometrics for 25 years, right? I mean, you know, and they've been for other people, they've been for my own companies as well. And I've seen a need, you know, for myself, for my own companies, and there's a gap in the market because whatever's out there isn't doing the job well enough, in my view. It isn't psychometrically robust enough. The science hasn't been done, or maybe it's a new field. There's not much in that field yet. That's true too of the work I've done on behalf of other people, where they said, I don't know, I'm really interested in the meta programs idea in NLP, right? That's amazing. or particular leadership styles that, sits alongside a leadership program that, we've come up with. So I've been doing this for a long time. StrengthScope is a measure of strengths, right? And the way we define strengths is these are underlying qualities that energize you and that you're great at, or you have the potential to become great at. They are fundamentally underpinned by values, and they are all about motivation, energy. What do you love? What do you enjoy most? What brings you to life about work? And me too, still now, like 16 years on, I can't, I totally love it. It runs right through.
Yeah.
And I think, when I started to develop it, it was almost giving language to something that was naturally a way that I was managing and running businesses, recruiting people, etc. I was hiring for people that seemed to be really energized by, what it was that we were doing. And then I would help them find their way, like with the options that we had available, the work that we could do in the business when they joined. But for me, it was about kind of fit, passion, energy, enthusiasm, all of those things. So this was then giving more science to it, more rigor to it. So StrengthScope has 24 strengths. You can see them actually on the strengths flower. That's not what you get as a report, by the way. That's just like a attention-grabbing image that we use on occasion. I really like that. Right. I like it. So there are relational strengths, emotional strengths, thinking strengths, and execution strengths. They fall into different kind of color quadrants you can see behind me. And they're all performance related. So the research that we did, we really wanted to make sure that they were related to work-based performance according to the research that had been done, not by ourselves, but by other people before us. So we saw on the shoulder of giants, as many people do in the psychometrics field, we wanted to make sure that what we'd done had a good background, it was drawn from science. And StrengthScope is based on positive psychology. Positive psychology sounds very positive and maybe a little bit happy, but actually it's the science of what goes right in life. And that's a big, important difference of StrengthScope compared to other tools, and all strengths assessments fall into this category. The science of what goes right in life is looking for what's worked, looking for what works now, and learning from that and building on that, rather than always and only looking for the deficit, the dysfunction, the negative, the gap in performance. And, we're awash with this negativity bias. We get it from birth. We're, always being told what not to do. We're always being told what we need to develop because we're weak in that area. There's a hole in the boat, it might sink our boat. Unfortunately, in the corporate world, when we finally get there after being told for years and years of criticism, that there are all these things we're doing wrong, we need to improve at. It doesn't get any better. We get into the corporate world and we're told, improve your presentation style, your skills at presenting are not good enough. Your time management is, it stinks, it doesn't really work. So you need to improve in that area. And we keep plugging these holes in the boat, hoping that's going to help us, but it's not putting wind in our sails, right? No. So to use that analogy, strengths is about that. It's about helping us navigate by bringing the best of who we can be, and then maximizing and leveraging that in a way that is conscious of our role, conscious of our career direction, but it's essentially, taking that energy that's naturally within us, knowing that's what's happening for us, and managing that energy in a way which is going to help us get good outcomes at work without that strength or that energy going into overdrive.
Yeah.
For us, there's a balance to be struck here. You can't, and go back in the day, some of the strengths researchers saying you could never overdo a strength. Yes, you can. It definitely happens. That,
I do.
We all do, and actually that can feel, for us, like the energy is high, like our autonomic nervous system is like telling us this is amazing, and yet people are withdrawing. People are moving away from us. We just have to understand why this is happening. That's what's happening. It'll be a strength and an energy, and you're not then getting the outcome you were seeking to get in the first place. So, however, the important thing here is it's not a weakness like we've maybe been told all this time. It's a strength. It's just that in that context, if you dial it down a little bit, or you bring in another strength to moderate the one that goes into overdrive and has that tendency, then you're going to get a better outcome. And so there's a whole kind of, this is lifetime, right? Like where you get more nuanced in the way that you're using your strengths. You bring in your, what we call significant 7, but also your bubbling unders, the ones that are kind of there, accessible and available to you. And it's a way of really building confidence actually around, I can overcome that challenge. I can deal with that difficult relationship. I can face into that presenting gig that I have that really worries me, you know, coming up for me, or that really tough meeting that's coming in next week, because I'm going to bring these strengths with me, and I'm going to make sure that I keep these ones at bay, because I know that they can be triggered when I'm under pressure, when I'm under stress. So you start with this kind of illumination, this like light bulbs, and light bulbs going off for people. People, by the way, regularly talk about having life-changing moments with this as an approach. Right. But that's because we don't talk about this stuff. We talk about what's wrong with us all the time.
Yeah.
So
it's all the failures, it's all the mistakes. We're not allowed, like, I mean, I just did a workshop on failure sharing, because we are so great at celebrating successes, but we do not learn from our failures together. Instead, there's something you're penalized for. And so I love this positive psychology piece of it. One of the things that's really resounding for me is this idea of the intrinsic motivation, because this is something that people find so abstract and difficult to nail down for their employees. So for leaders, this is a really crucial topic, right? Yeah. Because it's become a buzzword, but actually nothing's changed in the last decades, right? We still need to find what motivates that individual and then leverage that, right? And I love this piece as well about, you know, monitoring your reactions, because the only thing you can control is your reaction. So if you're stressed, of course you're going to react more poorly than you would if you were in a good space, right? So I really like that as a good tool. And I want to, because I am cognizant that we're going to run out of time very fast, because there's so much to discuss here, so we'll do it again with mics. But I wanted to ask you about tangible results you've seen. Obviously, no, not wanting to get you to talk about something that you can't talk about, but I'd love to know, you know, even a story about how you've seen it used where you really felt like, wow, that was why I did this. You know, this is why I created this.
Yeah. There's so many, actually. I mean, you know, I can talk about, there's a lot of researchers. In fact, I will send you, you know, the research kind of resources that I've drawn on in order to conclude around, you know, people who use their strengths more of the time generally tend to ... you know, and it will be feel more confident, have better relationships at work, feel less stressed, you know, be better collaborate, be more creative, right? There's a whole bunch of positive outcomes that come that have been proven, you know, by using reliable, valid, science-based approach. There's nothing kind of, you know, wishy-washy or horoscope here. This is like real, proper, natural scientific method related stuff. You know, as a psychologist, that was one of the things I love most about it, actually, is the fact that you're trained in natural science methodology. So, you know, you're given the same basic training in terms of experimental design as if you're
cool.
A physicist or whatever it is, right? It's the same exact method. You write up your experiments in the same way. So, you know, this is like proper hardcore stuff. It's hard to measure, but, you know, it's important that we do it like that. So there's a lot of good research out there. But I've got, you know, countless stories of people who've had that illuminating moment, who've had that light bulb, and they've gone, wow, I always thought I was like this. But now I realize my energy is driven from somewhere completely different. I feel I can breathe now. I can be that person. I can be me. You know, the chances of getting the same top 7 strengths in the same order as anyone else on strengths go 1 in 1.3 billion.
Really?
It's a surprise to me that you get people who see their profile for the first time. They're like, that's me. You understand me. It's like, yeah, it's as unique as your fingerprint, right? That's you. And that's
amazing.
I know. I mean, that level of individuality and uniqueness, right? That brings that sense of authenticity is palpable when you're having a one-to-one with someone, or you're in a room with people who are seeing their strengths really for the first time. And that's before you get into the strength stories. You know, you ask them, well, tell me about your empathy. How does that play out for you? Wow. You then get this whole like raft of stories around how this person has just loved stepping into the shoes of other people. They feel, embody other people, you know, like other people's emotions flow through them. There's all these incredible stories that you hear, but they're always different. Everyone has a different tale to tell about the strength set that they have. And, you know, that celebrates the uniqueness of individual human beings like nothing I've ever seen before. I just, you know, it's such a great ad to bring into a development process, because people just come to life. And actually, we've used it in recruitment as well, you know, particularly for exec roles, where you've this whole, you know, if you start with strengths, then you can go to the dark places after, because people, you know, will own strengths, then they'll own strengths in overdrive, and then they're willing to own genuine risk areas for themselves, you know. far
Well, they
easier.
understand them in a different context. I guess that's the key, right? I mean, look, I would love to talk about diversity of this and how it could be useful in the future, but we're going to run out of time. So I'm just going to come back to, I really see that this approaching it from this feeling of everything is a strength. It's just a matter of whether you're overusing that strength or not is very crucial. And I love how enthusiastic and excited you've gotten, because as soon as you start talking about the strength and the confidence, no, it's fantastic. I love that. I love it. That is exactly why, you're the person to talk to. And I'd love to do another follow-up on using it in organizations and using it in the future. But I guess I would like you to really give concrete takeaway for the audience in terms of what are some tips that you would give them when they're thinking about using a tool, StrengthScope, MBTI, whatever, what should they think about so they can make sure that they are being inclusive and using it in a non-biased way, because this is the big concern. Like, you mentioned that people still call it a horoscope. It's more scientific than some of the predictions we make in business all the time. We're trying to predict trends, and this is more scientific than predicting a trend, right? So, so please do share. What is the thing we need to think about?
Okay. So thank you. It's a great question. So I think first of all is do your research. I think I talked about that quite a bit at the beginning. So, work out what it is that you're looking to try and predict, right? What are you looking for in your development or in your selection process, whatever you're designing? Know exactly and precisely what it is that you're wanting to measure. Then go look for something that appears to be fit for purpose. Go look on the Psychological Testing Center, BPS, or equivalent to make sure that you've got that. Ask for the technical manual, ask searching questions of the authors. Is this reliable? Is this valid? Is the science fit for purpose? Give me the data that backs that up, right? Share with me and show me that this will work for me, because it's really important. And then get trained or get a professional in who has been trained in the use of that tool. Super important to make sure it's used in an unbiased way. And then you have a defensible case. If it ever happens that someone comes back and says, I don't think it was okay how that was used in that context. If you've done all of those things, you'll have done work, and you'll be on the right side of the law, and ethically you'll be in the right place as well.
I think ethically is very important. This is, it's personal to people. People forget it's about humans, and these are humans that work for you. So if you don't use it in the right way, or you don't make it defensible, then shouldn't be really using them, right? Yeah. A final message, aspirational takeaway, or one final story, whatever you like. I'd love for you to just share, because obviously you're very passionate about this subject, and we will come back to you and do another session another time. But what's your final thoughts?
Yeah, I think don't be afraid of psychometrics, right? Go out, do the work, find out about them, find one that's going to work for you, or more than one. And if you're interested in really understanding the human, understanding the authentic human being that you're talking to, I would fully advocate. It doesn't have to be StrengthScope, but a strengths assessment tool, ideally one that's fit for purpose, that actually works. Go find that, because that allows you to uncover all of these layers of human richness in yourself, actually, as well as in other people you're working with. And it can really help enormously with teams and that connection and understanding that you're looking for to enable collaboration as well. So, that would be there are plenty of ways you can find out about those tools out there, Google it, etc. But I would definitely recommend just checking it out, because it's a whole new field. It's only been around maybe a decade, maybe 15 years. Psychometrics, like we say, has been around since the late 19th century. So, it's relatively new, but there's really good science behind it, and it's really taking off.
And finding the right tool for you, that's exactly the right message. So there you have it. Remember, this is a valuable tool in your toolkit for employee development when used correctly and with care. Thank you so much for joining us, Paul. And just for the audience, the audio will be shared on Spotify, the video will be shared on YouTube. Information on where to find Paul on LinkedIn and his website will be underneath both. Thanks so much for joining, and we'll see you again. Thanks, Paul.
Thanks, Raj.